Major funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television.
Babbitt, Dukakis, Gephardt, Jackson, Simon. Their campaigns for the White House faced the first test of Election 88 in Iowa in less than 20 days. Earlier tonight in Des Moines, the candidates faced each other in a Democratic presidential candidates debate. Focusing on minority issues, the forum was organized by the Brown and Black Coalition of Iowa.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second Brown-Black Presidential Forum. We're pleased tonight to host 5 Democratic Party candidates. This is the only nationwide forum that concentrates on Black and Hispanic issues. In Iowa, there are less than 30,000 Hispanics. However, Iowa's Hispanics are representative of the problems facing Hispanics nationwide. Our population has grown faster than the general population in Iowa. This is in keeping with the national trend that indicates that by the year 2010, Hispanics will be the largest minority in the United States. Over 11% of Iowa's Hispanic children live in poverty, and our total Iowa population in poverty reflects closely the national Hispanic poverty rate of 40%. In education, Hispanics are disproportionately represented in both dropout and suspension rates in 9 Iowa cities. These rates are comparable to national figures. However, we are making progress with the election of our first Hispanic in Iowa, Alderman Gilbert Sierra of Davenport. Esta noche tenemos una oportunidad que la gente hispana pueden hablar con una voz. Los problemas que tenemos no se pueden esperar. Claro que los líderes de los Estados Unidos necesitan escuchar cuando hispanos están unidos. Nuestra lucha para justicia es nuestra esperanza. The struggle for justice is our hope. And now I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Mr. Wayne Ford.
In the spirit of Martin Luther King, I welcome you. In 1976, minority leaders from the state of Iowa came together to organize our first minority presidential forum. Democratic candidates sent their representatives to discuss minority issues. In 1984, the Brown and Black Coalition was formed to continue to expand upon that tradition. 4 candidates appeared in person, and that forum was a tremendous success. Minorities from across the nation had a chance to assess those candidates on the basis of their minority viewpoints. Iowa has one of the smallest minority populations in America, but what we are about to experience today is a clear example that when brown and black people work together, their impact can be just as great as any other segment of the American society. We are sure in the season of Martin Luther King's birthday that if he was with us today, that he would be very proud of this historic event. I hope that you, the audience, statewide and national viewers, truly judge these candidates on their opinions about minority issues. Martin Luther King once said, "We must never lose infinite hope," and our forum is a clear example of that. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the second Brown and Black Coalition Presidential Forum. Thank you.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Yo soy Paula Plasencia. We welcome you tonight to our forum, and our format will be as follows. The opening remarks will be made by each candidate. They will be given 1 minute apiece. That will be followed by a question period where there will be 10 questions from the panelists given. Each candidate that is asked the first directed question will have 1.5 minutes to answer. Each of the other 4 candidates will be given 1 minute each to respond to that same question. Then we will follow with a candidate-to-candidate follow-up question. Each candidate will ask 1 question to another candidate which has been predetermined. Each candidate will have 30 seconds to ask that question. The question will be one of the topic areas given to the candidates and on the minority issues and interests we have stated. The candidate answering the question will be given 1 minute to answer. Then we will have the closing statements by each candidate, which will be a minute apiece.
I'm Harry Flipping. I want to welcome you here this evening. Let me share with you our panelists for this event. On my near right, we have Dr. Lenola Allen Somerville, who is assistant professor at Iowa State University. Next to her, we have Mr. Alfredo V. Alvarez, who is Service Coordinator for the Department of Human Services. Next to him, we have Mr. Don Nickerson, who is attorney for Babbage, Bennett, and Nickerson. And next to him, we have Ms. Christina Flores Hansen, who is an attorney in public practice. We also have our timekeepers, Mr. Lando X. Valadez and Ms. Teresa Villalobos.
Candidates, on behalf of the Brown and Black Coalition, we welcome you to our debate, and your presence tonight is evidence that our concerns are of importance to you. The 5 Democratic candidates presidential candidates who are with us tonight, to my left will be Reverend Jesse Jackson when he arrives. Congressman Richard Gephardt. Governor Michael Dukakis. Senator Paul Simon. And former Governor of Arizona, Bruce Babbitt. We also ask that the audience please withhold their applause. This will take away from the airing time, and we are on a tight schedule. We also ask that the candidates please hold your opening statements to 1 minute and your remarks to the times that we have given. Any time that you go over, you will either be cut off or this will affect your closing statements. We will begin with Reverend Jesse Jackson. Sir, would you give your opening remark?
Let me express my thanks and delight the chance to share in such a forum that will have an impact upon this campaign and upon our nation. We met Dr. King in 1955 appealing to us to end racial violence in this country as a matter of law. The extent to which we have public accommodations and the right to vote, that is now a fact. He left us in Memphis asking us to end, as a nation, economic violence. And that is why black and brown forums are important. It's why black and brown forums and small farmers must come together, because there are still barriers yet to be broken down. We must fundamentally shift not just the law, but shift our attitude. We must end a pattern of discrimination expressed in lack of opportunity for black and brown people for upward mobility. We must shift our focus from jail care and welfare on the backside to Head Start and daycare on the front side. Let's educate our children. That's the key to a new America.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Next, we will have Congressman Richard Gephardt.
In a very real sense, this debate tonight goes to the heart of what the Democratic Party is really all about. The powerful and the privileged, they don't really need a president to speak for them. They can take care of themselves. Our Democratic Party has had a different cause and a different history. We can be proud that the civil rights struggle of the 40s and the 60s really started within the Democratic Party. We can be proud that we moved the American conscience. But now we've got to regain the ground that's been lost. The climate of the Reagan years have stirred again the winds of prejudice. We can see it all across the land in the echoes of things said and in the results in things left undone. So we must wipe the stain of injustice away from the Justice Department. We need an Attorney General that goes to court to enforce the civil rights laws, not to explain whether or not the Attorney General has broken the conflict of interest laws.
Excuse me, thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Next, we have Governor Michael Dukakis.
There's a woman in my state that I'd like to talk to you about this evening to start this discussion. To me, she personifies the American dream and what this election is all about. Ruby Sampson was the oldest of 13 in the family of a Georgia sharecropper. She never went beyond the 7th grade. She married, came to Boston, had 3 children, was divorced, was on welfare for 14 years. Thanks to an employment and training program for people like Ruby Sampson, she was given the opportunity to get real training for a real job, daycare for her children, extended health benefits. And today, Ruby Sampson, that woman who was on welfare for 14 years, is a surgical technician in one of the finest teaching hospitals in the world. To me, that is the promise of America. We didn't offer Ruby a make-work job or a minimum wage job for herself and her kids. We gave her an opportunity to be independent and self-sufficient. That is the promise of America, and that is what this election is all about. I want to be a president who extends that promise to millions and millions of Ruby Sampsons.
Excuse me.
That's the kind of president we need, and with your help,
Thank you, Governor
that's the kind of
Dukakis.
president I intend to be.
Excuse me. Told you we're on a tight schedule. Next, Senator Simon.
Look at where we have been at the record, not just what we say. I was, as a young state legislator, fighting for civil rights with Martin Luther King down in Montgomery. I was a chief sponsor, chief author of the Black Colleges and University Act, held the first hearings for Hispanics in higher education, helped the handicapped a number of ways, chief author of the Tribally Controlled Community College Act. But more than that, I oppose the Reagan Tax Act of 1981 that has caused this huge deficit and the loss of millions of jobs. I support legal aid to the poor, supported the minimum wage. Civil rights, in a very real sense, in 1988 is composed of two things: jobs and quality education, and I'm a leader on both. Look at the record, not just the speeches and commercials.
Thank you, Senator Simon. And now we have Governor Bruce Babbitt.
This is the first time I've ever been asked to dream in precisely 60 seconds. I believe that that dream has to be translated into reality. And right now, the Reagan administration is using that budget deficit to destroy the commitment that we've already made. And I think we have to start fighting back. We need to understand that that budget deficit is being used to break up the commitments we've made to children and our parents and others. I believe we start by addressing the budget deficit by talking about reducing expenditures, not across the board, but on the basis of targeting according to needs tests. And I believe we must raise revenues. I propose a progressive national consumption tax because I believe that dealing with that deficit directly, humanely, preserving programs for people who need them, and raising the money to provide programs for people who need them is a way to translate that dream into reality.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt.
Let's move now to our questions from our panelists, starting first with Dr. Lenola Allen Somerville to Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, the struggle for educational reality and security has been and continues to be a long battle for ethnic minorities, especially Black Americans. The NAACP and various committees report that approximately 40% of minority youth are functionally illiterate. A greater proportion of minorities drop out of school. Achievement test scores are declining, and achievement gaps regarding skills are widening. As president, what will be your federal agenda for ensuring educational access, equity, and excellence for ethnic minorities?
First of all, blacks and browns need more than a balanced budget. They need a commitment by a president to end discrimination based upon race and based upon color and based upon language. That's why we must resist an English-only proposition that's designed to be deceitful and mean toward Hispanic-speaking or looking peoples. That's why we must not support schools with federal monies that discriminate against people just because they're black, because they are female. We must have a commitment to daycare. There must be a commitment to adequate nutritional programs, because if youth do not have an adequate foundation in the early years, a decent house, if their parent cannot make minimum wage, then their legs are cut off before they even start. Lastly, these universities, Iowa State, Iowa, if they can recruit young Black Americans to play ball and entertain them, they can also recruit young blacks in the fields of science, art, literature, and become teachers and coaches as well. Let's go beyond just playing ball together. Let's also teach together and administer together, and then let us grow together.
Thank you, Representative Gephardt.
I think the first thing to say is that our commitment to education in the last 7 years, especially education of disadvantaged youngsters and minorities, has been lessened and lessened by a great deal. I could just read the number of programs that have been cut, and in the last budget, the President requested be eliminated. Immigrant and refugee education, migrant education, vocational education, women's educational equity, civil rights training and technical assistance, follow-through, public library services, college work study, and the list goes on. It is obvious our commitment to education of minorities and education of disadvantaged youngsters has been broken by this administration. So I would start by trying to restore the programs that have been eliminated or the programs that have been cut back. Second, I think we have to do something about the disparity of funding between districts. I've co-sponsored legislation to ask states to give incentives to states to equalize funding between districts so that the disparities that occur today don't occur in the future.
Governor Dukakis.
If I'm elected President of the United States, I will have three fundamental priorities. The first has to do with teaching. We're not going to educate our youngsters, minority youngsters, and all youngsters, when half of our public school teachers are going to be retiring in the next 10 years and we have very few young people interested in teaching. As President, I want to be the #1 advocate for good teaching and good teachers. I want to work to make teaching a valued and honored profession once again. We've got to provide scholarships to young people willing to make a commitment to teaching. We've got to revive that National Teacher Corps, and I hope we could encourage lots and lots of minority young people to go into that. Secondly, I believe in a fundamental principle, and that is that no youngster who finishes high school and is qualified to do college work ever should be denied that opportunity because of financial need. That's basic, that's fundamental. And finally, we've got to do something about adult illiteracy in this country. Nearly 25 million Americans are functionally illiterate. And I think we should organize a citizen volunteer literacy corps across this country that for relatively little money
Thank you, Governor. Senator
will
Simon.
make it possible for millions to become literate and to have that gift.
Senator Simon.
I join Mike in saying one of the priorities has to be adult education. We ought to be able, in a 7-year period, to massively assault this problem. 158 nations in the United Nations, we're 49th in our literacy rate. We can do infinitely better than that. Number two, we have to recognize precisely what you said is correct. And I can give you statistics that are even grimmer than the ones that you just gave me. Intensified preschool education programs in disadvantaged areas really pay off in a dramatic change in the dropout rate, teenage pregnancy rate, and crime rate. We know it. It's not theory. We're not doing anything about it. And third, we're going to have to do things to attract and keep good people in the teaching profession. Teachers in Japan are paid approximately the same as lawyers, doctors, and engineers, in the top 10%. I don't need to tell you where teachers are in the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt.
I agree with Paul, and for that matter, with Dick and Mike and Jesse. I agree with all of them. I think there are two things that I can add. First of all, Dick Gephardt talked about the civil rights issue of equal funding among school districts. I take that a step further. I believe that equalization of funding and the lack of it is a constitutional issue. And if I'm president, I will request the Congress to mandate basic, fundamental equality of funding in every district in this country because it's a civil rights issue. Secondly, we're losing our kids in the first grade because the first grade isn't soon enough in this society. As president, I will advocate a uniform national system of daycare assistance for working parents because that's an incentive to work and it's the beginning of the education process. I'd follow that up with universal Head Start and say we can have an education system in which we get kids started so that they're not lost by the time they enter the first grade.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt.
Mr. Alvarez, you're next.
Congressman Gephardt, I want to thank you first for being the first candidate to commit to our forum. My question is that the American judiciary has seen the appointment of the first black on the United States Supreme Court and more recently the first woman. In October 1987, over 100 Hispanic leaders representing elected, appointed, civic, professional, and business members met and drafted a document called the National Hispanic Agenda. The NHA advocates that the next president appoint an Hispanic to the U.S. Supreme Court. Will you publicly commit to appointing an Hispanic to the High Court?
I have often said that I would want my appointments to the Supreme Court and my appointments to the Cabinet and other high official positions to reflect the diversity of the American people. It was said a moment ago here in one of the statements that by the year 2000, Hispanic Americans are likely to be the largest minority population in the United States. It is obvious that this administration has not made a commitment to appointing people who reflect the diversity of the American people. I would do that because I don't see how the American people can look at their leaders, whether they're on the Supreme Court or in a cabinet, and see people who don't look like them, who don't come from their backgrounds, at least in enough cases, and feel that they can lead and inspire and motivate the country. So that is my pledge and my commitment, and I would do that with the court, I'd do that with the cabinet, I'd do that with all the appointments that I would have to make as president.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Governor Dukakis?
Well, I agree with Dick, and let me go one step further. I've been a chief executive now going into my 10th year. I've appointed 116 judges for life, because in my state the governor has the same authority to appoint judges that the president has. And I've done so with the help of the Judicial Nominating Council, which, by the way, includes Hispanic and black citizens, who screen every candidate for judgeship and recommend 3 finalists to me, from which I pick one. And we've been able to appoint first-rate people from a wide diversity of backgrounds, black, Hispanic, male and female, and I'm very proud of those appointments. That is precisely the kind of attitude and the kind of approach I would bring to the presidency. And let me say one other thing. When I get those 3 finalists, I interview every single one of them personally before nominating one for a judgeship. I can't imagine nominating somebody for a judgeship, and especially a position on the Supreme Court of the United States, who I had only met 5 minutes before the press conference. And that is what happened in this administration.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. Senator Simon?
I agree with Dick and Mike. We have to have representative appointments, whether they are to the court or where they are. But in terms of the court, one of the things that has to be done first is to appoint an Attorney General of the United States who's sensitive to minorities, and that calls for a substantial change from what we have right now. One of the best votes I cast was voting against Ed Meese's confirmation for Attorney General of the United States. But people ought to be able to look to the federal government and say, this really represents us, whether us are Hispanics or blacks or Asian Americans or people with disabilities or who they are. They ought to be able to look at that government and say, this really represents the people of the United States.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt?
Thank you. During my time in Arizona, I think it's fair to ask people not what they intend to do only, but what they've done. I appointed blacks at all levels in state government in twice their percentage in the Arizona workforce. I doubled the percentage of Hispanics employed in state government. I appointed blacks and Hispanics to the court. 25% of all of my judicial appointments were minority groups and women. There's one more thing that I think is important, and that is that all of our appointments reflect a commitment to civil rights. Because if there's a sense of despair and frustration in this country, it's that at all levels of government, people seem to be unwilling to stick up for affirmative action, for hiring, for placing, for enforcing civil rights laws. And I think we all need to commit that no matter who we appoint, the bottom line qualification is to reverse the neglect of civil rights enforcement in this country.
Excuse me. Thank you, Governor Babbitt. Reverend Jesse Jackson?
In 1984, when some of my competitors turned to Reaganomics, Graham Ruppman Hollins, I turned to registration so as to empower the black and the brown, those who had been locked out. Led a drive in 1981 when Mr. Reagan tried to curtail the Voting Rights Act to keep empowering the black, the brown, the poor. The result of our work was, by 86, we had a majority U.S. Senate Democratic. We defeated Bork in 87. I said it's not enough to defeat Bork, let's recommend an Hispanic for the Supreme Court so as to make it specifically more representative. I am convinced we must make a judgment not just, however, from the top down, Mr. Alvarez, but from the bottom up. 4 years, full-time college scholarship for black and Hispanic youth, less than $30,000. 4 years full-time penitentiary scholarship, more than $120,000. Let's choose education on the front side and not penitentiaries on the back side. Judicial from the bottom up as well as the top down.
Excuse me. Thank you, Reverend Jackson.
We'll move now to panelist Don Nickerson. Question to Governor Dukakis.
Governor Dukakis, the National Urban League recently published its report concerning the status of blacks in America. One vital concern of that report was crime in America and its disproportionate effect on blacks in terms of victims and perpetrators. Some of those statistics refer to blacks in 1986 being touched by crime, 27% of all households. We're 12% of the population, yet 27% of all FBI arrests, or arrests tracked by the FBI, I should say. For American males at large, you've got about a 1 in 133 chance of murder, death by murder. For black males, 1 in 21 chance of dying by murder, okay? Now, how do we decrease the number of perpetrators, the number of victims? How do we set a new tone, a new agenda for eradicating crime in this country?
Well, I think you have to begin by analyzing what are the fundamental reasons why people commit crimes. What is it about their community, their hopes, their aspirations, or the lack thereof that make it necessary for them to resort to crime? In my state, we've cut crime in the last 4 years by more than any other state in the country, with one exception. The homicide rate is the lowest of any industrial state in America, and our unemployment rate is 2.9%. I think there's a relationship there. I have no doubt that there's a relationship. When people are working, when they're going to school, when there is hope, when there is economic opportunity, when there are good jobs at good wages, when people know that the schools they go to and the training they're getting are going to lead to economic opportunity and to a decent life and an opportunity for themselves and their kids to grow and expand their horizons and live a good life, the chances of their engaging in crime, the chances of their resorting to crime are much, much reduced. And that is why it seems to me the single most important priority for the next President of the United States has got to be to build an economic future in this country in which there is genuine hope and opportunity for every single citizen in the land, no matter who they are or where they come from or what the color of their skin. Now, I happen to believe in tough law enforcement. I believe that we must go into our schools and begin drug education early so that our kids will be spared the scourge of drugs and drug addiction, and there are a whole range of things that we must do. But
thank you,
if there is an
Governor
opportunity
Dukakis.
out there,
Senator Simon.
Then we will continue to confront this situation, and it will continue to be very, very serious.
Senator Simon.
Sorry, Paul. The key word is hope. The great division in our society is not between black and white, not between Hispanic and Anglo, not even between rich and poor. It is between people who have hope and people who have given up. And we have to give that spark of hope to people. And there are two things that can do it. One is seeing themselves move ahead educationally or seeing their children do it. And we have to do that, and we're not providing that for too many people. And the second is to deal meaningfully with this whole problem of what some call the underclass, structural unemployment. And I have offered a jobs bill, the only program that really deals with this in a meaningful way. And the distinguished sociologist William Wilson, I'm pleased, has praised my proposal. What we have to do is to give people hope, and we can do it if we're creative.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt.
I don't think there's any question that jobs is the issue. Decent jobs. First of all, we raise the minimum wage so that people have some incentive to work and they can support their families. Secondly, we have to deal with those school dropouts by finding some way to target employment opportunities conditioned upon finishing high school. Now, third, we have to get this economy going. And we don't do it by widening the deficit with a gigantic public works program. We get it going by recognizing that real economic growth depends upon dealing honestly with that deficit. And that means reducing expenditures, not across the board, but by reducing expenditures, by targeting benefits so that people who don't need the benefits are the ones who have them reduced. And if we believe in getting this economy going, we must have the courage to say the T word, to say we're going to deal with that deficit with a progressive tax increase.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt. Reverend Jackson.
I think a fact is missing in these analyses about jobs. A black and a brown youth is more likely to go to jail because he or she is black and brown. There's a racism factor in the judicial system and a class factor in it. It's like when the poor are caught, they go to San Quentin. The rich, the presidents, go to San Clemente. There's a double system here. And at another level, let's define crime. I was in Miami this past week meeting with the Coast Guard officials. They cut 10,000 pounds of cocaine in '86, 25,000 pounds in '87. Then they were cut by $100 million. 2,000 workers cut to stop drugs from coming in. Now they want to spend February 3rd $100 million to go to the Contras in Central America. There's no greater act today that is more criminal in its nature than cut $100 million from the Coast Guard and send $100 million to the Contras in Central America. That's real ugly crime.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Let's go now to Representative Gephardt.
I would agree with what's been said, and I won't be repetitive, but I think there's another factor here, and that is that the top leadership of the country has to provide an example to people about crime. This administration has given the words sleaze factor a new meaning. We have an attorney general, ladies, we have an attorney general that spends more time in the courtroom as a defendant than as a prosecutor. And we have had an administration whose top officials, including Michael Deaver, who was a top advisor to the president, who winds up using his influence after being in office to try to enrich himself and to make money. Now, with that kind of an example, how in the world can we hope to deal with the crime problem and give people hope and give people an example and a role model so that they do live a life that's free of crime? We got to have a new administration that moves in a different direction.
Ms. Hanson.
Senator Simon, the Reagan administration has been openly committed to the elimination of minority businesses' set-aside programs and to the emasculation of agencies such as the Small Business Administration and the Minority Business Development Agency. Hispanics and other minorities share traditional American values of economic development, competition, and growth. What initiatives or incentives will you propose as president to stimulate entrepreneurial growth among minorities? Specifically, please discuss enterprise zones, tax incentives, loan guarantee programs, or the negative impact upon minority economic development of omnibus contracting.
Well, I strongly believe in retaining the Small Business Administration. They just wanted to do away with that in addition to the set-aside. The great growth in jobs in this country is going to come from small businesses. And as you look at the untapped talent that we have in this country, you have to come to the conclusion that minorities and women really are the groups that we ought to be encouraging most. And so I want to do everything I can, both by example, through federal contracts, by set-asides, through the SBA, to see that we move in a constructive direction right there. That, it seems to me, is basic. And then let's use other agencies in addition to the Small Business Administration. We have the Urban Development Action Grant Program. We ought to be using that. We ought to, for example, be using the Department of Defense much more. Last year, the Department of Defense spent $9 billion purchasing things outside the United States. I think We can make a lot of those purchases right in the United States. And I think we can encourage employment in pockets of unemployment and encourage minorities and women at the same time. It can be done. It takes leadership.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt?
Yeah, I think we should all support SBA, the loan guarantee programs. They've certainly proven successful. I think as Democrats, we've been a little slow to support the enterprise zone concept. I support it strongly. You know, there is an interesting example of an enterprise zone that really works. The problem is it's not in the United States. It's in Mexico. And it's an enterprise zone which gives incentives and which has created 300,000 jobs right across the American border. Now, if we can set up those kind of incentives to create jobs in Mexico, which I support, surely we can create incentives to put those jobs in cities where unemployed kids are standing on street corners without a chance in life. Lastly, the best way to help small businesses is to get interest rates down. And the way to get interest rates down is to recognize that we have to do something about that budget deficit. And we must have the courage to get some real economic growth going, get interest rates down by cutting expenditures and raising revenues. You've heard me say that before.
Babbitt. Excuse me. Thank you. Reverend Jesse Jackson.
The enterprise zone on the Mexican side has more to do with allowing cheap labor to undercut organized labor than it does raising standard of living for Mexicans on one side of the border and for Americans on the other. As was stated previously by Governor Babbitt, for example, Zenith left Chicago and skipped through Texas on the way to Mexico. Now they have twin plants, except on the Mexican side, 4,000 workers at less than $1 an hour, and on the American side, 4 workers with a billboard pointing toward Mexico. That's not your better example of an enterprise zone, because people in the zone must be developed and not exploited. Secondly, we must have business set-asides for government contracts. 3, businesses that get government contracts must set aside minority contracts so as not to subsidize discrimination. Lastly, I have used consumer power to get 7-Eleven and Coke and Budweiser and Burger King to open up to minority businesses and workers. I've used meager resources.
Jackson. Congressman Gephardt.
We need to fight for set-asides for minority businesses. This administration for 7 years has refused to enforce the laws that we have tried to pass so that they would be a reality. The Small Business Administration has been an important source of capital for minority businesses. This administration has tried to get rid of it, and the Congress has saved it. Probably the thing small businesses need most is capital, and I want to be a president who pays attention, both through the budget and through what we do with the Federal Reserve, to get capital for minority businesses. Finally, trade is a big issue. We allow products made by slave labor in other countries to be sold in this country, and often those are the products that are made by small growing businesses. We need to enforce the trade laws and the trade treaties so that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Governor Dukakis.
You know, all of these things make sense, and I support them. But a few weeks ago, we had a debate in Edinburgh, Texas, down in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, where unemployment is 25 and 30 and 35%. 1 out of every 3 adults looking for work and can't find it. If the next president of the United States doesn't know something about how you rebuild economies, how you bring growth and prosperity to those regions and communities of the country that are hurting and hurting badly, then all of these things aren't going to be worth very much. And I hope as president that I can bring the kind of investment of public resources, private initiative, bring minority entrepreneurs into the process early and build that kind of growth in those parts of the country. If we don't do that, if we have whole counties and regions of this country that look like the Depression, then there isn't going to be much opportunity for a minority or, for that matter, any other entrepreneur. But we can do it. I'm an optimist. I think we have tremendous possibilities ahead, but we're going to have to take public resources, combine them with the private initiative, the minority community, and build that kind of opportunity all across the country.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis.
Let's move now to panelist Dr. Leona Allen Somerville.
Governor Babbitt will expand on the economic issue. One of the Democratic presidential candidates has identified radical economic polarization as part of a twofold problem facing our country. And we note blacks are twice as often unemployed as whites, and nearly 50% of all black families are born in poverty, and nearly 40% of all black teenagers are unemployed or unemployable for lack of skills, as well as minority entrepreneurs, single heads of households. The aged and females document bipolar inequities as well as expanded needs. How would you address the economic polarization problems in ways that would best improve the quality of life for minorities?
The first thing I do is raise the minimum wage. The quickest anti-poverty program we can put together is to raise the minimum wage from $3.45 an hour to $4.50, so that people struggling at the bottom end will have a decent income. I reject protectionism as a way to create jobs. I think in the long run it's going to weaken our economy. I reject what I call the Hong Kong economy. That's corporate executives who are creating golden parachutes for themselves while they're handing out pink slips to employees, who are raising their bonuses while they're cutting wages. It's no way to build an economy. I advocate building this economy by what I call workplace democracy, by saying to those managers, you've got to bring employees in, give them reasonable working conditions, motivate them to work, and share the profits so that we can begin to create real productivity, create an American workplace that is exactly the opposite of IBP, of the Hong Kong economy, where people try to compete by cutting wages, by lowering working standards. That's not the way to do it, and we can do better, and presidential leadership is what's required.
Thank you, Governor. Let's move now to Reverend Jesse Jackson.
What is so very basic and clear to me about economic development is it has a double measure. One measure is we must face the fact of discrimination based upon race and sex in this administration. I want to enforce the law and inspire Americans to the point that they realize the advantages of opening up to make room for black and Hispanic and female people. When we consider that we are 1/3 of this hemisphere and 2/3 of our neighbors are Hispanic-speaking peoples, it is in our national interest to bring down language barriers, that we lose genius by closing these doors. If the Dr. King holiday means anything, it means that if we can die together on foreign soil and pay taxes together April 15th and play ball together during the big playoff season, let's open up and remove all barriers for everybody.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Let's move now to Congressman Gephardt.
About a year ago, I announced a plan for stopping poverty and the polarization that you've talked about. The first step is affirmative action, which has been forgotten by this administration. The only way we're going to stop discrimination in employment and in education is through affirmative action. That needs to be brought back. Second, we need welfare reform. It's got to be different than it is today. We've got to encourage families to stay together. The present welfare system doesn't. We've got to give people real education and training options, which don't exist today. We have to do something about giving working mothers the chance to have Medicaid follow them into a new job. We need Head Start for more youngsters. 1 of 7 youngsters eligible for Head Start can get it. We know that early childhood education works. We need to do something about parents as first teachers. We have a program in Missouri that tries to help educate parents to be the first teachers of their children. It's a program that works. We can do it nationally. There are other parts, but I think we've got to attack this problem head on.
Let's go to Governor Dukakis.
Well, let me follow up on what I said just a few minutes ago. It's all right to talk about enterprise zones, not a bad idea, except nobody wants to go to an enterprise zone if there isn't enterprise and activity there. And it's important to do all of the things that we've been talking about by way of education and preschool education and Head Start and these kinds of things, very important. I remember visiting a Head Start program in Marshalltown, a wonderful program of preschool education, and I said to the director, I said, how many of the parents of these kids are working? And she said, very few. And I said, how come? She said, there aren't any jobs. There aren't any jobs. And those of you who have lived through the past 7 or 8 years here in Iowa, in the Middle West, know what that means. So the next president has got to be somebody who can create and build jobs. And I've proposed a National Economic Development Fund of $500 million, 1/7 of the cost of Star Wars, which we don't need and, by the way, can't afford. 1/7 of the cost of Star Wars to invest in jobs and economic development in communities that need those jobs. That's where you have to begin.
Thank you,
Otherwise,
Governor.
all of these things just don't work.
Let's go to Senator Simon now.
I agree on the need for jobs, but we're going to have to do more than simply have $500 million proposals to get there. And I don't say that that's not a significant thing, but we have to do much more than that. We have to deal with this whole question of the underclass. We have to lift the opportunity that adults have in our society to do more. And then you're going to see this nation coming together as it should, with a president who appeals to the noble in us and not the greed in us. I was in a call-in radio program in Chicago talking about my jobs program, and a woman called in and said, "You know why I'm not working, don't you?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I really don't." And she said, "The blacks are getting all the jobs." We are pitting group against group, age against age, ethnic group against ethnic group. We as a nation have to move ahead. We have to have leadership with a vision and an understanding of where we must go.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Alvarez.
Reverend Jackson, Cuba was expelled in 1961 from the Organization of American States under heavy U.S. influence. In November 1987 at Acapulco, Mexico, 8 member nations met and agreed to try to modify the OAS, which would include allowing Cuba back into the organization and once again becoming linked with other Latin American countries. In light that the nations will again meet in April, what is your position on admitting Cuba into the OAS, and under what preconditions, if any?
It would be wise to let Cuba back in as we move toward broader communications and try to resolve tension and conflict. If Nixon can go to China, if Reagan can host Gorbachev, an American president can meet with Castro of Cuba, I did. The result is I brought Americans and Cubans back home. I took Castro to church for the first time in 30 years to help ease church-state tensions, got him to agree to the Contadora process, got him to agree to return Mariel prisoners. A key factor in peace in Central America is Cuba's influence in that region, which is the powerful influence. We would do better through negotiations and diplomacy than through the attempts of assassination or a boycott that is essentially ineffective. I'm for expanding communication. If we can talk with South Africa, and we ought to, and Gorbachev, and we ought to, if we can talk with China, and we ought to, we can talk with Cuba in our own hemisphere. It is a key to peace in Central America. It's sound and good judgment. Better we talk than fight. We have everything to gain and virtually nothing to lose.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Congressman Gephardt.
I would not favor their readmission at this time. I think that it is something that can be seen down the road, but I think that in order to make it happen, we have to begin adopting a different policy ourselves in Central and South America. I think we have to cut off contra-aid. I've led the fight on that 8 times in the House, and I think that's important. We have to begin negotiations through the Arias Peace Plan. I think that's important in lessening tensions in the region. We have to change our policy with regard to what Cuba is doing in Africa. And I think if we would adjust some of the policies that we have been following, that maybe the Cuban influence in Africa could be abated. If some of these things were done, and if Cuba adopted different positions than they've often had, then I think we could begin to talk about the possibility of being able to negotiate with Cuba again, and maybe even down the road being able to adjust the present circumstance.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Governor Dukakis.
I think we're making some progress in our relationship with Cuba. The new immigration agreement, I think, is a small step forward, but I would like to see some clear evidence that Cuba is committed to the principles of the Organization of American States, and especially human rights and freedom and an open and pluralistic society before they return to the OAS. But I think there's a much more serious question. Is the United States committed to the principles of the Organization of American States? And if so, why are we violating the Charter of the OAS in what we're doing in Central America? Because our effort to overthrow the Nicaraguan government is a clear violation of the OAS Charter, of the Rio Treaty. It's a failed and it's an illegal policy. And I want this country to begin respecting the law, not breaking it. That's the kind of country I believe in. I think that's the kind of country the United States and its citizens believe in. We are doing everything we can to wreck the Arias plan. We're doing everything we can. Our best hope for peace in Central America, to stop the killing and begin the peace process. And this administration is doing everything it can to destroy that plan. I would reverse it, stop Contra-Aid, get behind the Arias plan, and begin to live up to the principles of the Charter of the Organization
Thank you, Governor
of American
Dukakis.
States.
Excuse me, Senator Simon.
National policy should serve the national interest and not the national passion. Our present policy toward Cuba serves the national passion, but does not serve the national interest. Our national interest is to see to it that Cuba moves away from being a satellite of the Soviet Union. And we ought to see what can be done to change that. I think that could include initially, for example, selling food and medicine to Cuba. At the same time, the President ought to appoint an advisory committee of Cuban-American citizens to advise on the future relationship and stand up for human rights. People snickered when Jimmy Carter stood up for human rights, but it's a strange thing. You can go into a small village in Latin America or Asia or Africa, they know about it. If we stand up and we say we would welcome change, I think there is a possibility of change.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt.
Well, I don't see how we can effectively oppose Cuban entry into the OAS if and when the other Latin American countries decide that that's in their interest. How is it that we hold ourselves up as a more effective judge of the interests of the Latin American countries than they themselves? So I would listen to them. That's exactly what I would do in Central America with the Adios Peace Plan. I would attempt to get the Cubans out of South Africa. You see, we're on the wrong side of history in South Africa because we are supporting South Africans as proxies in the fighting in Angola. And that's wrong. And we ought to stop it and get on the right side of history in South Africa by extending liaison recognition to the African National Congress, to the South African Trade Union Congress, withdrawing our support from the white South African mercenaries and saying to the Soviet Union, we expect you to withdraw your support from the Cubans and get on the right side of history in South Africa.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt.
Let's move now to Mr. Don Nickerson.
Congressman Gephardt, this is my last question, so I want to keep this international and try to make it best I can. South Africa, talked about by Governor Babbitt, okay? What should be our position relative to what we're doing or not doing in South Africa? We've got a policy of constructive engagement, the President calls it, whereby we hope to persuade and by soft pressure change the apartheid system. Do you believe in constructive engagement? Is that enough? Should we be doing something more?
I don't believe in constructive engagement. I think it's a policy that has been shown to be failed. I think we have to have a new policy, and we tried to describe that in legislation we passed in the House Democratic Caucus and on the House floor. It was a bill sponsored by Representative Ron Dellums and Representative Bill Gray. It was not a soft approach, it was a hard approach. It sent the strongest possible message to South Africa that we demand change in their immoral policy of racial separation. It completely divested American businesses in South Africa. It cut off trade with South Africa in every way. It was a clear statement. It was the kind of bold statement that we need to make. Unfortunately, that was watered down by the Republican Senate, and it's been further watered down by what this president has done. Now, let me say one other thing. You know, back in the 60s, there was a big difference when we had presidents who said segregation is wrong. We need a president in this country who says apartheid in South Africa is wrong. and a president who will lead our allies to work with us to send the strongest possible message to the South Africans that the world will not put up with that policy anymore.
Thank you. Let's move now to Governor Dukakis.
Well, constructive engagement has been a failure. As a matter of fact, somebody suggested the other day that we try constructive engagement in Central America and a boycott South Africa, not vice versa, and I agree with them. I think we've got to be much, much tougher on South Africa. I think we've got to join with the international community in imposing tough sanctions. I think we've got to work with the frontline Southern African states to help them grow and expand their economies and their futures and reduce their dependency on South Africa. I think we've got to get serious about the independence of Namibia, and I think we have to put the full moral force of this nation behind that effort. I would also end this absolutely bizarre policy in Angola, where we have the United States providing weapons to a rebel force supported principally by South Africa, that rebel force attacking the Cuban army, which is defending American oil companies. Now, if you can figure that out, let me know. I think it's an absolutely bizarre policy, and I can tell you if I'm president, it will end immediately.
Thank you, Governor. Over to you, Senator Simon.
By choice, I serve as chair of the African Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. 4 years ago, I spent half a day with Bishop Tutu. He said South Africa is headed toward unbelievable violence, and there's only one country that can prevent it because of your economic muscle, and that's the United States of America. And he is right. Apartheid is going to go. The only question is whether it's going to go peacefully or violently. And we ought to be on the side of rapid, peaceful change. And unfortunately, we are not. I helped override the president's veto on sanctions, but we ought to do much more than that. Angola, Mike is right. Our policy is wrong. The United Nations, instead of vetoing resolutions, we should be leading the charge on resolutions. We ought to be asking our friends in Western Europe and Japan to stop buying South African coal. Last year, Japan bought $1.6 billion worth of South African coal. We can be much, much stronger than we now are.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt.
Back in 1965, I went to the streets of Selma, Alabama, in the days right after an event that we now know as Bloody Sunday. It was the beginning of 2 years that I spent in the civil rights and anti-poverty movement in America, in the South, fighting for a simple principle, that every single American is entitled to the protection of the Constitution and the right to vote. We are now supporting a government in South Africa which explicitly denies those principles, which is engaged in resegregating and uprooting people, brutalizing them, denying them of their rights, imprisoning children. It's a totalitarian, racist society. And I don't understand how it is we can continue to recognize a government which is the antithesis of our own principles. And it's for that reason that I would say to Pretoria, you're no longer the sole representative of South Africa, and begin extending liaison to the blacks, the African National Congress, the South African Trade Union Congress, and start standing up for recognition of the wrongs that are being inflicted upon that country.
Number one, we need to have a policy for Southern Africa. South Africa is an empire whose tentacles extend 3,000 miles to the north. Cuba is not in South Africa. Cuba is in Angola, not by invasion, but by invitation, protecting American interests there, Gulf Chevron oil depot in Cabinda. We'll do 4 things. 1, have a summit meeting with frontline African heads of state, as we've done with Western European heads of state. Secondly, sanctions against South Africa as strong as those against Libya. Order all American companies out by a date certain, unless there are open, free, and fair elections. Thirdly, security. Frontline states need defensive weaponry to defend themselves from South Africa's destabilization tactics. And fourthly, a development plan so Zimbabwe and Zambia can trade out of out of Mozambique and not have to go through South Africa.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson.
Ms. Hanson, your next question.
Governor Dukakis, in examining welfare reform, always popular at election time, popular issues considered include workfare programs, job training programs, and daycare. The federal government and some businesses are offering daycare services to their employees. The Federal Tax Reform Act allows some corporations to provide an important daycare benefit to their employees, which effectively serves to reduce taxable income. Unfortunately, many studies demonstrate that these services and programs, where in effect, actually impact and are of primary benefit to the middle-class employee and not to the low-income employee or to the welfare recipient who desperately wants to work but cannot without the benefit or because of the lack of daycare services. What legislation would you propose to provide daycare services to the individuals that are most in need, the welfare recipients and the low-income American?
Well, some of us, I think most of us, have been working on welfare reform now for a lot more than just this election season. And the 50 governors of this country, Republicans, by the way, as well as Democrats, have now proposed a plan to the Congress, and the House of Representatives have already passed it. It's now in the Senate, which will finally give us a welfare system in this country that makes as its first priority helping people to lift themselves out of poverty, to get good jobs, earn good incomes, and support themselves and their kids. I'm proud to say that it's based on the success of states like mine and others. In the case of my own state, over 40,000 welfare families have been helped to move from welfare to work in the past 4 years, 4.5 years alone. And we've done it with three basic things: real training for real jobs for those welfare mothers, principally, and some fathers; daycare for their children, which is absolutely essential. If you don't provide child care, you can forget about helping these families to lift themselves out of poverty; and extended health benefits, so we don't cut these welfare families off of Medicaid 4 months after they leave welfare, which is what we do in this country. And I will tell you it's working. Paul talked about the underclass. Folks, I can tell you from my own experience that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of families out there who want work, who want the dignity of work, and can be helped with this program. Now, for reasons I don't understand, the White House opposes it. I don't get that. This is a bipartisan effort to help
Governor.
hundreds of thousands of families lift themselves out of poverty, and it works.
Thank you,
works.
Governor. Senator Simon.
First, the assumption of your question is absolutely valid. What we are ending up with is child care, in some cases, for middle-income people. Even there, we need more encouragement through tax laws and in other ways. But we have to lift people through education, through minimum wage. And then, I mentioned before, preschool education programs. That ought to be tied in with the whole child care thing. I am for federal assistance on child care, but I am not for it if it is simply custodial and safe. That's nice. I want it also enriching. So we really can help young people and their future, and we can do it. There's no question about it. The question is whether we care enough. And I want a government that cares enough, that's willing to lead.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt.
You see, we've built a system in this country in which way too many examples exist of benefits that ironically are going in the wrong direction. My family gets a daycare assistance tax credit. Women coming off welfare in many areas get no support at all. We subsidize the purchase of second homes, of mansions on seashores, in a society where the homeless are lying in the streets of cities, in the doorways of jewelry stores. And we have to be honest about refocusing benefits and targeting them on the basis of need. Now, in the case of daycare, I believe we should go much further than any of the people here have suggested. I would advocate a daycare voucher system, scaled to income, needs tested, which says to every working parent, here's a piece of paper and you can take it to provide support and nurture for your child, to a basement co-op, to a proprietary daycare center, to a church, to wherever, to make a simple statement.
Thank you, Governor
We're giving you
Babbitt.
incentives to work, and we're beginning the education of your child.
Thank you, Governor. Reverend Jackson.
Monopoly by a few creates welfare for the many. Cargill, Conagra, Iowa Beef, GE, GM, their monopolists create welfare by drying up jobs because they control production, distribution, and politicians through the PAC process. Case in point would be GE. The number one exporter from Taiwan is not Taiwan, it's GE, which owns RCA, which owns NBC, says Buy America. Well, they close down plants here, take our jobs to Taiwan, cheap labor, sell it back here at high profits. Between 81 and 83, they made $6 billion, paid zero taxes, got a $182 million tax rebate, while folk on unemployment compensation had to pay taxes. Friends, that is not fair. We're subsidizing the rich, we're pauperizing the poor. The poor do not need motivation through workfare. They need to get paid for the work they do. To clean out somebody's bathroom and not get paid, the rich would have to be motivated. The poor do it every day. They just need to get paid for the work that they do.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Congressman Gephardt.
Yesterday in Des Moines, I talked to some single mothers who, some of whom were on welfare and some of whom have been trying to get off. And they said that under the present system, it's better to stay on welfare than to get off because you can make more money the way the system works today. We've been trying to change that. They also said that even if that were changed, if you didn't have a continuation of Medicaid and you didn't have a way to care for your children with a federal or state or private subsidized program, then again, they couldn't get off welfare. We got to decide whether we're serious about people getting off welfare. If we really are, then we have to put in place the kind of things that will allow them to be able to do that. That's what the welfare reform effort we've been talking about is. And if we're serious in the years ahead, we'll make it more than just a speech and rhetoric. We'll put some real programs behind that. And daycare, which has to be done by both federal, state, and private levels, is a very important part of getting that done.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt.
Let's move now to panelist Dr. Leona Allen Somerville.
Senator Simon, we've addressed a number of selected issues and concerns related to Black and Hispanic Americans. At this moment, would you identify and rank in order of most to least importance the top 5 priorities regarding your national leadership for ethnic minorities?
One is, we've talked about jobs, clearly, decent jobs. Number 2, education. And that's preschool. It means elementary and secondary. So we don't have like a dropout rate in Louisiana today, 46.8%. Dropout rate in New York City schools, 61% for Hispanics, 57% for Blacks. We have to enrich the quality of education. Education clearly has to be a major part of where we go and what we do. Third, I want to see that my government is really representative. I was the first white subcommittee chairman in the House outside of the African subcommittee to ever appoint a Black subcommittee director. I hate to tell you, I'm the 3rd United States Senator in the history of the United States Senate to have a Black subcommittee director there. I want that government really to be represented. And then in other issues, the most fundamental thing is that we have a government that cares. And that means housing. That's clearly a major need, but it goes beyond that to recreation. It's a number of things. But fundamental, clear across as most fundamental, is a government that cares and leads.
Thank you very much. We remind candidates and panelists 30 seconds for the question, 1 minute for response. Now over to you, Governor Babbitt.
Employment, education, health care, civil rights, affirmative action, and housing. But you see, It's all window shopping. We can sit up here all night and lay out these priorities. But until we have the courage to deal with that deficit, it's a cruel hoax. Because as we sit here and dream tonight, the Reagan administration is using that deficit not only to frustrate the dreams, but to destroy the programs that are already out there. And our silence on that deficit guarantees that all of this will never come to reality. And therefore, when I say jobs, health care, education, housing, and affirmative action, I beg of you, please ask each one of us, how are you going to pay for it? Do you have the courage to name the programs that you'll cut so we can take care of the people who really need the help? And ask each one of us, do you have the courage to deal with that deficit by talking honestly about raising taxes so that we can have programs for people that need them?
Thank you,
Because
Governor.
otherwise it's all just walking down Fifth Avenue, wishing
Reverend
the
Jackson.
future away.
Reverend Jackson, your response, please.
Bruce Babbitt often talks about courage and honesty. The best thing that these candidates could do in a list of 5 to help the black, the brown, and poor would be to support Jesse Jackson for president. That's the first step in that direction. So, priority number 1, support Jesse Jackson for president. Number 2, voter enforcement. Because if the black and the poor and the women who've been denied the right to vote have the political power, they can help themselves and not just be helped by someone else. Thirdly, jobs, the alternative to welfare and the span, the key to self-respect. Fourth, education. We must think our way out and be a part of the creative process. That's why we can't not just play basketball for our state and our, we must also be able to coach and become deans. Lastly, housing. If birds can provide nests for other birds and bees can provide hives, human beings can provide houses for other human beings.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Now to Congressman Gephardt.
We obviously would all agree on housing and education and jobs. They're obviously the agenda that has to be fulfilled. I think affirmative action is got to be at the top of the list, because if you do all of the things but you still have inherent discrimination, then we're not going to get this job done. But I'd like to also go to the budget question. Let's all remember one thing. 15% of the federal budget is everything we think of in the domestic agenda. We spend $300 billion on defense. We spend $10 billion on education. We spend $11 billion this year on corn subsidies, which we could get rid of, or largely get rid of, with the Harkin-Gephardt Save the Family Farm Act. We spend $1 billion on educating children under 5 years old. We need to get our priorities straightened out. That's the first thing we need to do.
Thank you very much. Governor Dukakis.
I knew we were going to get the Harkin-Gephardt bill in here somehow tonight. Dick did it. All of us are for all of these things. And all of us have laid out in great detail what we would do with that budget deficit. And I can tell you, Bruce, that it won't include a national sales tax that soaks the little guy. I can't imagine a worse tax program. Well, you tell me about a progressive sales tax, and look, that's a
100%.
That's a Republican tax bill, and I will have no part of it. I think it's a bad idea. But in the last analysis,
Poor people paying no tax is a Republican idea?
it hits the middle class right between the eyes, and it's a Republican tax bill, and I think we ought to reject it out of hand. I get a little more time, don't I? Because Bruce kept cutting in.
May we stay with the issue?
It's the guy in the White House who's going to set the tone. It's the guy in the White House who's going to bring us together. We've had an administration for 7 years in this country that has divided us, that's polarized us, that's torn us apart. I want to be a president who brings us together.
Thank you, Governor.
Mr. Alvarez, your next question.
Governor Babbitt, the Immigration Reform Act has been a failure. The number of applications fall far short of the projections. The filing fees and associated expenses have proven astronomical. Exclusionary criteria is excessive. American children are in fact subject to deportation, and American-born citizens are being subjected to discrimination, resulting from employer sanctions. Do you support extension of the application time, the continuation of employer sanctions, and how will your administration address, quote, the immigration problem?
Bueno, estoy de acuerdo con todos los problemas que usted describe. Tiene razón. Does that count on my 30 seconds? The urgent issue on the immigration bill is to extend the deadline. It's clear that the Justice Department has not reached out and attempted to get the information to people who are entitled to amnesty, and it would be a cruel hoax, a deliberate destruction of the agreement that they made to do that. Now, the real issue behind that immigration bill, I believe, lies in Mexico and Central America. If you were a young head of household in Michoacan or Sonora or Culiacan or in one of those countries, where would you be trying to go? You'd be trying to cross the border, wouldn't you, to go north? And ultimately, the way to deal with the immigration issue is not to pass more laws attempting to stem that tide by excluding people, but to start settling up the warfare and the chaos in Central America and extending the hand of economic development and reducing third world debt and paying attention to Mexico and Central America.
Excuse me, thank you. Reverend Jackson.
The immigration policy, as we now know it, is discriminatory against Hispanic-looking persons. My state manager in Texas, Dr. Mondo Gutierrez, a PhD in political science, when trying to get several jobs, had to prove he was an American citizen, and he's been an American citizen by family across the years. Somehow, as long as there's war in Central America and poverty is going to drive people across the border, we need a Pan-American policy for the entire hemisphere. I was in McAllen, Texas a month ago. A man, his wife, and mother-in-law, 2 children along the side of the road, cutting broccoli for $2 an hour. They were working. They had no outdoor toilets. They were emptying their bodies in the open field. The children should have been in school. Child labor laws were being violated. I submit to you, my friends, we would do well to have a comprehensive economic policy for the hemisphere and energy policy, and not a war policy that complicates the situation. Indiscrimination against all American citizens by race, sex, or culture.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Congressman Gephardt.
We should extend the time, and we should also go back and look at employer sanctions as we go along to see if they are being used correctly. A lot of us in the Congress had a great concern that employer sanctions would result in discrimination, and that may be the case, and we've got to make sure it's not the case. And if it is, we've got to change the law or change the regulations or move on to something else. But the big challenge with Mexico and with immigration in Central America is an economic question. We have to help the countries of that region make their economies work. It is in our direct self-interest that we do that. The twin plants that we've talked about are part of it. There are problems with that program. We've got to make it work. We ought to have long-term energy contracts, especially for natural gas with Mexico. And finally, we've got to find a way to deal with Mexican debt. The way we're doing it doesn't work, and we need to find a way that it does work. And when we can begin dealing with all of those problems, then immigration as a problem will go away.
Excuse me. Thank you, Congressman. Governor Dukakis.
I think Bruce has got a lousy tax plan, but I agree with him completely when it comes to this subject. If we don't stop...
My tax plan is a lot better than your phantom plan to collect money from under the mattresses of people.
Yeah.
Excuse me, we're running close to time. Could we please stick to the issues?
But he's right about Central America.
How many taxes?
If that war continues, if we don't stop the killing and get behind the peace process, there will be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in Central America who are going to come north because they can't take it any longer. That is why getting behind the peace process is so important. Now, I do think we could do one other thing in the administration of our immigration laws, and that is to make sure that families are not torn apart. That is not necessary under the law. It's not needed, and any administration that I'm responsible for is going to have an administrator of that law who understands that keeping families together is an important part of what the American dream is all about. We can do that under the existing law, and we should.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Simon.
Yes, 2 things are immediately needed. One is the family unification permission, and the INS can do that by regulation. They do not need a change in the law. They have already, at one point, extended the deadline informally, and that could be done again. But the big thing is that we work with Mexico to lift the economy of that country, and both the United States and Mexico will benefit. There are no two nations neighboring each other anywhere in the world where there is as great a diversity in quality of life, in standard of living, as between the United States and Mexico. And Mexico today has 85 million people. If Mexico reaches the point of zero population growth by the year 2000, Mexico will have 175 million. If that doesn't happen until the year 2020, it will be 275 million. Clearly, we ought to be working with Mexico. It is in our interest and the interest of the people of Mexico.
Thank you, Senator Simon.
Now
Now we move to the candidate follow-up questions. Due to the time limit that we're running behind, we ask that each candidate will only make their question to 15 seconds, and your response to that is 45 seconds.
And we'll start with Representative Gephardt, a question to Governor Dukakis.
Mike, the question of homelessness is the one I'd like you to address. What have you done about it in the state of Massachusetts, and as president, what would you like to do about it on a national basis?
Dick, I don't know of any problem that faces this country that more symbolizes what we have to do to make this country whole again. I'm proud to say that I've got the most comprehensive homeless prevention program in the country. We're one of the few states that invest state funds in subsidized housing for families of low and moderate income. But we're lucky, we're doing well, and we have the resources. I want to create a national partnership for affordable housing that brings everybody in the housing community into this. Builders, developers, nonprofit organizations, community action agencies, the federal, state, and local governments. We have got to get back in the business of building and rehabilitating housing for families of low and moderate income. We've walked away from that. The President has, I regret to say the Congress has. And it's time we recommitted ourselves to one fundamental principle, and that is that every American family, every American, is entitled to decent and affordable shelter.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. Senator Simon, your question to Governor Babbitt.
Bruce, you favor moving more and more into a loan program for people to go to college. That has been the thrust of this administration. Loan programs cost the federal government more money in the long run, and number two, they discriminate, because those of us who are white males can repay loans more easily than females or members of minority groups. Do you want to back off on that and come up with a better program?
No. Paul, you got to be kidding when you say that a loan program is more expensive than a grant program. That's just like your budget proposals.
This year, the federal
somehow it doesn't add up. The numbers just don't work. Now, here's my proposal. I'll make loans available to anybody at low interest. How do you repay them? National service, VISTA, the Peace Corps, the military, serve your country. If you can't, I would limit repayment to a modest part of your income and ultimately forgive the loans. But what I'm saying is, you got to get your economics straight. And secondly, there's nothing wrong about telling a student, borrow the money. We'll let you pay it back if you can, and if you can't, we'll forgive it. What's wrong with that?
Costs a lot more money. This year, the federal government spends $1.6 billion for defaulted
Thank you very
loans.
much, gentlemen. Now, Reverend Jackson to Congressman Gephardt.
Congressman Gephardt, Cuba is in Angola by invitation. South Africa is in Angola and in Namibia by occupation and invasion. Who should leave Angola first, Cuba or South Africa?
If we could back up a new policy to get South Africa out, then I think Cuba would leave.
Correct.
We have not been a leader in that respect. We have been encouraging, I think, in many ways, the South African government to do all of the things that it does because we haven't stood up for change. We haven't stood up for change on apartheid. The Congress had to override a veto of the President on the policy that we wanted the country to have. And incidentally, I think that was one of the highest and best moments of the Congress's changing policy in our country. and I'm proud of what we did. So if we could move in all these respects, I think Cuba would back off. So what I was trying to say a moment ago, if we would begin to move in some different directions, maybe we could get to the point where a negotiation with Cuba could take place.
Thank you,
but we've got to
Congressman
start
Gephardt.
moving on some of these problems.
Thank you. Governor Dukakis, your question to Senator Simon.
Paul, we have now 12,000 strategic nuclear warheads, enough to blow up the Soviet Union 40 times over, and they have 11,000, so they can do it to us. And we've talked tonight about the importance of investing in education, and economic development, and training, and health care, and housing. Why spend $50 billion we don't have on the Midget Man missile?
The question is not only the Midget Man missile. The question is the whole business of piling up more and more and more nuclear weapons endlessly. We have to pick and choose. We clearly don't need both a Midget Man and an MX. We don't need both a stealth bomber and a B-1. We have to pick and choose. We have to have an adequate defense, but we ought to work out agreements with the Soviet Union so that both of us step back from the edge of the cliff. If the United States and the Soviet Union keep piling up weapons as we now are, eventually someone somewhere is going to strike a match. We can do much, much better for future generations than we are now doing.
Thank you, Senator Simon.
Governor Babbitt to Reverend Jackson.
Jesse, some of our colleagues have been dealing with this issue of cutting expenditures by a thing called Gramm-Rudman, which cuts everything across the board equally, whether it's children, AIDS, research, Star Wars, presidential libraries. I've talked about an alternative which says you make choices. You preserve the programs that people need, and you get rid of the military and domestic ones that people don't need. Now, my question is, if you were Dick Gephardt or Paul Simon, would you have voted for Gramm-Rudman?
I would not have voted for Gramm-Rudman because it's basically unfair. It taxes the very wealthy and the very poor equally, which by definition is unequal. As I said, it's ham and egg justice. The chicken drops the egg and moves on. The rich drop the egg. The poor have to drop the leg, total sacrifice, and they cannot move on. And so Gramm-Rudman Hollins sacrifices the poor and does not charge the rich and the powerful adequately. Mr. Reagan gave the rich and powerful a $600 billion tax break. They didn't reinvest in America. They had a party. Now they want those who were not invited to the party to pay for the party. That is not fair. Let's have a fair tax system.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Now we have come to the part of the closing statements by our candidates. Gentlemen, due to the fact that we are running over time, your closing statement will be limited to 30 seconds and you will be cut off. We will begin with Reverend Jackson.
We must be sensitive to black and brown concerns, but not segregate them. At this point in history, the rural farmer, the urban black and brown must have common ground. This time, let's not fight each other. Let's fight together at the plant gate to save our jobs. Let's fight together to save our farms. Let's fight together to raise minimum wage. Let's turn to each other and not on each other, and let's rise together and not sink apart.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Again, we ask you to withhold your applause. We're on a very tight schedule. Congressman Gephardt.
There's a passage from Scripture that Dr. Martin Luther King often quoted, and it went like this: "Let judgment roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream." In the Reagan years, justice has been rolled back and the stream has been dammed up. And there's no more urgent task before us now than the moral imperative of equality. We have changed the laws. Now we have to change American lives. And as we stand for equality and affirmative action, we also have to stand for economic equality.
Thank you,
That's our
Congressman.
great mission in this next administration.
Governor Dukakis.
This week we celebrate the memory of a man who talked about a dream. I'm a product of that dream. I believe in it. And I believe working together that we can help that dream come true for every single citizen in this land, no matter who they are or where they come from or what the color of their skin. Porque poco a poco paso a paso, mano a mano. Juntos vamos a ganar. Slowly but surely, step by step, hand in hand, we're going to win. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Simon.
Can we do better? Of course we can. Day before yesterday, Jesse Jackson and I were down in Atlanta for the service honoring Martin Luther King. He dreamed, he cared, he acted. That's what we need as a nation. Leadership that leads, that cares, that acts. We have the talent, we have the resources. What we need is the leadership that cares and dreams and acts, and I'm ready to provide it.
Thank you, Senator. Governor Babbitt.
We talk together and frequently of that dream. We ought to remember that Martin Luther King Jr. had not only a dream, but a plan, a course of action that he was willing to fight for and that he ultimately died for. We all together, every Democrat here in this audience and at this table, we all share that dream. I've tried to be different by saying that we must have a plan. We have to have the capacity to fight and to be specific and honest and talk about how we set priorities and how we deal with the obstacles in the way and have the courage to talk about cutting expenditures, to protect programs, to raise revenues, to say,
thank you,
we're going to
Governor
get
Babbitt.
together and we'll fight for that dream. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This ends the televised portion of the Brown-Black Presidential Forum. I want to thank the candidates, our panel, and most of all you for coming out. Thank you very much. Remain seated, candidates, please, and panelists.
Major funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television.